Hello, and welcome to R Programming from Microsoft Developers. My name is Chris Burns. You can follow me on Twitter at ForecastCloudy. The agenda for this session, a brief overview of the R language, why it's becoming more and more relevant. We'll go over an introduction to R tools for Visual Studio, which we will refer to as RTVS. We're going to install those R tools into Visual Studio, and we're going to take a first look at their capabilities. All right, so let's quickly go over a brief overview of R. R is a language that's all about the data. It's not an object-oriented language. It's not a compiled language. It is a derivative of S. Now, S was created in 1976 by a gentleman named John Chambers at Bell Labs. S was rewritten in 1988 in C. The original libraries were in Fortran. The downside, however, was that it was a commercial language. It was not open source. In 1993, the first version of R was released to the public by Rossi Haka and Robert Gentleman, two professors out of the University of Auckland. They called it the R language for Ross and Robert. In '95, a gentleman by the name of Martin Mackler convinced them to release it under the GNU license, and today it still remains under that license. It's maintained today by CRAN, C-R-A-N, that's the Comprehensive R Archive Network. And you may be thinking, how is a 40-year-old language all of a sudden relevant today? And the answer is because it's about the data, because it's math-based. It's for statistical computing, predictive analysis, and general data analysis. Math has not changed much in 40 years. All right, so why the sudden interest in R? Why should you be using R? Well, and the answer is relatively straightforward. Nearly all modern applications will require data analysis somewhere in the workflow. With the evolution of service-oriented architectures into microarchitectures with cloud-native applications, it's entirely possible you will need data analysis to compose the most efficient workflow. Or in other words, you may need data analysis just to tell you how to build an application. If you're a developer today, we are basically all data scientists, which goes back to my phrase that you're going to hear me repeat over and over again. It's all about the data. We have a lot of cloud technologies that allow us to build composable applications. There's languages like Go that are concurrent. We have our standards like C#. However, it's all about the data. I want to draw one distinction here. You see the quote I have on the screen: information is derived from data when data is processed, organized, structured, or presented in a given context so as to make it useful. Information and data are different. I say it's all about the data because that's the raw form of the information. So now that you've had an incredibly brief introduction to R, I want to give an equally brief introduction to some of the existing tools for working with R today. The first is the R console. It's been available quite some time, still available today. It's available at r-project.org. One of the things I forgot to mention earlier, one of the primary goals of John Chambers back in '76 when he created S was he set out to create a programming language that was easily accessible to statisticians. And what I mean by easily accessible is he wanted to create a programming language simple enough to be used by folks who were not programmers, but also available to those who were programmers who needed access to higher level functions. Those statisticians, those non-developers, non-programmers could continually build on their skill set and eventually become developers themselves. So I want you to keep that in mind when we look at the R console. Granted, John Chambers created S back in '76. R is, of course, a derivative of that. But keep that in mind when we're looking at this this simple interface. It's not meant to be an expansive IDE. All that being said, don't underestimate the power of the R console. I'm certainly not just speaking about it disparagingly. It's very impressive graphing capabilities. It's lightweight. It's available on all modern operating systems. A couple years ago, when I first started learning R, it was my go-to. Also here we have RStudio. Now RStudio is available at rstudio.com. Now RStudio bills itself as open source and enterprise ready professional software for R. As you can see, it's a little bit more like a traditional IDE as we know them today. Multiple simultaneous views, full integration with Shiny. Shiny we'll get to in a future session. That is basically R for the web. Excellent stuff. But like I said, we'll dedicate a video to that later on. Now, we could spend an entire session on R console and RStudio. That's not the point of this series. I want to just give you a quick look at what tools are available today to work in R. That'll give you a nice context when we're looking at RTVS, which is, of course, a perfect seg for the next session. All right, here we are. Our tools for Visual Studio. Took me just under 5 minutes to get to the actual topic of the session, so I'm not doing too bad. Um, URL right here if you want to get the bits yourself. Now, in classic Microsoft fashion, they've made it very easy to install RTVS. For you Mac and Linux users, unfortunately, Visual Studio 2015 is a dependency, so no support just yet, unless you're, of course, running some kind of virtualization software on your Mac. Now, the requirements: Visual Studio 2015 Update 1, have to have that. Update 1 is required, and this works with 2015 Community version, Professional version, or Enterprise version. Now, our tools for Visual Studio, it's an independent download. And then you see here, download Microsoft R Open. You also need the R library. Even though they've integrated R tools into Visual Studio, R is not supported by the .NET CLR. It's got its own engine, its own runtime. And we got two flavors to choose from now. You have the R version 3.2.4 called Very Secure Dishes from CRAN. That's under the GPL license. That's the traditional R license. And now we also have MRO, Microsoft R Open, R being the R language. I'd pause there for a moment because in 2015, Microsoft bought Revolution Analytics, and it used to be called Revolution R Open. Now it's called Microsoft R Open. All right, now I've cut directly to Visual Studio with RTVS already installed. It's incredibly simple installation. There's certainly no value in watching me install the bits there. But before we open a new project for R, I do want to draw your attention to the menu bar. Once installed, you see we have a new option here for R tools. This could give you some insight into what's included in the R tools, plotting, which we'll get to in another session. The windows specific to R, we'll cover those in just a moment, one by one. One thing I wanted to draw your attention to, and this is give yourself a pat on the back, I guess. Do something for yourself. If you're anything like me and you've been a developer for any length of time, this should make you feel good. This is telling you that rather than chasing the learning curve, you're actually riding that learning curve. But just a little something silly that I wanted to draw your attention to. Now, the other setting here of interest is the data science settings. Clicking this is going to prompt us to basically rearrange our layout. I'm going to say no to that right now, and then we'll get back to that in just a moment. So we're going to go ahead and launch it on our project. Now, your templates may be different depending on your settings, what you have by default, but R is going to be found down here in other languages. R. And we only have one option for a project, so we'll just click that. You see I've been playing a little bit with this. And we have an R workspace. Now, before I begin speaking about the R specific attributes of this workspace, I want to visit the Solution Explorer. As we can see, it's a pretty familiar look. We have our solution file, which I'm going to drag into the window. Very standard, some default settings here, but something that we're certainly used to seeing in C# or even VB.NET solutions. Next, we have our history file, .r history. Now, this file, just as its name suggests, allows you to store history in file form. We're going to see in later sessions that R, you can save your workspace in some pretty interesting ways. This history file allows you to bring back your not only your history, where you can hit the up and down arrows at the prompt to see what you've typed in the past, but it's going to keep some variables in memory and such. Now, the project file, this is an interesting one. If you're a C# developer or a VB.NET developer, you may notice that this project file is different than what we're used to. So here we have in the view here the R project file, and I want to drag into the view a classic C# project file, and we can see quite a bit of difference. This is the XML that we're accustomed to. So this new file format for the project file is Microsoft's way of coping with the R workspace. We're going to talk about that workspace, as I mentioned, in a future session. And then finally, we come to our script.r file. This is basically a main.cs. If you are a C# developer, this is your R file where you're going to be able to store functions, variables. Now, R files, you can have as many R files as you'd like. This is where basically your code is going to live. So they can be loosely compared to the CS files, as I have already referred them to, but they're not, however, class-based. R does not have classes. The functions, the code that you put in these files won't be compiled. Think of them just as a collection of functions kept in separate files for code reuse, of course, or just code order best practices, etc. Now, let's go back to our R Tools menu and go ahead and flip this to data science settings. Again, this is just asking me if I'm certain I want to switch to R data scientist settings. I do, and it's also going to ask me if I want my shortcuts to be compatible with RStudio. RStudio we briefly touched on a little bit ago. All right, and now what we see here is we have some windows specific to the R environment. The first one I want to point your attention to is here, the R Interactive. Now this is a REPL window, REPL. If you've ever written any Python or Ruby, you're going to be familiar with the REPL. REPL means read, evaluate, print loop. We're going to have a session dedicated to that in its entirety, and we're also going to be using that throughout the entire course. So I don't want to go too much into it just now. Just understand it's got full IntelliSense support. Essentially, Visual Studio has encapsulated that R console right here into the R interactive window. Now, over here we have our variable explorer. If I were to create a variable in R, I'm setting a variable of x equal to 10. We see our variable explorer is going to list that for me, and I'm going to see its value, I'm going to see its class type, so on and so forth. We got the history again, as we've already mentioned. Now, because I've issued a command into the REPL window, it's going to track my history here, where x is going to be equal to 10. And then, of course, we have our R help. Now, this should populate here in just a moment. Hit home. There we are. If you're new to R, you're going to become very, very familiar with R help. I can't stress the importance of R help. It's like the MSDN, essentially, if you were an old school .NET developer like I was. And it's going to give you information on syntax, on use, any questions you have about a particular package or class in R. This is where you're going to come to find that information. So a quick recap. We've had the briefest of brief history lessons on R. Some options for working with R before Visual Studio, before RTVS. And then finally, we had a whirlwind tour of RTVS in action here. So on the next session, we're actually going to start digging into the R language itself. We're going to learn some syntax. We're going to do some basic functions. And then we're going to continue to build on that into more and more complex until finally that we write our own algorithms for some HD insight out on Azure. So I certainly hope this has been informative to you. It's been a lot of fun for me to make this video, and I hope to see you in the next session. Thank you.